Good morning, Malcolm, and welcome to joining in our church at Skipton Baptist Church this morning. Let us know where you are and what you do normally.
Hi, Lisa. Well, I am in Northern Ireland in County Down. I live just by Strangford Lough, and normally in my day job, I am the pastor of a church here in Northern Ireland called Dundonald Church, and that takes up most of my responsibilities. I do some other things around that, but that takes up most of my responsibilities.
Excellent. Well, we're well used to a Northern Irish accent over here at this church, so hopefully we'll be able to understand you really well this morning.
Yeah, I think your colleague is from Dundonald, actually, isn't he?
He is indeed, yes.
Yeah,
good connections there. So we're talking, we're doing a series on life with Jesus, and this morning we're talking about weeping with Jesus, which is probably quite an unusual thing to be thinking about. And I just wondered, first of all, what kind of things make you cry, Malcolm? Is it movies or cute pets or injustice? You know, what kind of things make you cry?
Well, cute pets don't make me cry, although I do have two very cute golden retrievers here too, Woody and Buzz, for those of you that are interested. I cry at injustice when I see people being mistreated. Music makes me cry. It has a power to touch my soul. Art can make me cry. And occasionally movies, normally movies that are rooted in a story of tragedy or triumph, or a real life story. Like my favorite movie of all time is The Elephant Man.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a scene in The Elephant Man where he's being chased by children, and he runs down into an underground or a station toilet and runs out onto the steps, and they're laughing at him and poking him with sticks. And he turns to them and he screams at them, "I am not an animal." And every time I see it, I've watched it hundreds of times, it breaks my heart. So injustice, really, people being mistreated, and if that's articulated in music or in art or in cinema or theatre or ballet or opera, that can really I love the opera and the ballet, so they make me cry.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I know that a couple of years ago now, you went through a really intense period of loss and grief. And I know that's led you to write a really important book just now. One of the verses that I think we often go back to when we talk about weeping and Jesus is obviously that really short verse in John 11 that says Jesus wept. And I guess I read it and sometimes I think, well, did he really? Or is it just there for effect? And what does that mean? I wonder whether you could just explain that a little bit.
Well, John 11:35 in English has a translation as Jesus wept. It's actually, that gives the idea that actually it was a moment, and it passed. It certainly is. In Greek, it's a moment that passed, but it's better translated as Jesus began sobbing. So what happens in that short verse could be seen as an articulation of the incarnation, I think, in cameo. And he breaks his heart. In my own translation of that, I will sometimes use the phrase Jesus began to break his heart, or Jesus began to sob. And his tears are very real. I guess the question is, why did he cry? Because he has just told Martha and Mary, "Do you trust me?" And he knew that he was on his way to bring Lazarus back from the dead. For listeners and for folk in your congregation and visitors to church this morning who don't know the passage of John 11, it's the story of two sisters whose brother gets ill and dies, and they send a message to Jesus. They're very close friends of Jesus. They send a message to Jesus asking him to come and help, and he doesn't come. He deliberately stays away. The beginning of the story says that although Jesus loved Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, he remained away for 4 days. And so then he tells his disciples that are with him, we're going to see Lazarus now. And because he's asleep, but he uses an idiom in Aramaic that means he's dead. The equivalent of he has passed on. And his disciples say, well, if he's asleep, he'll waken up again, because they think he means he's asleep. And Jesus says, no, he's dead. He says to them, no, Lazarus has died. And they then follow him. They get very confused about what he's going to do. But when he gets there, Mary and Martha are very cross at him Martha runs out to him and says, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But even now I know that you are the Son of God. And Jesus says to Martha, Martha, your brother will live again. And Martha responds with a theological answer. She says, yes, I know he will live again in the last day in the resurrection. And Jesus says, no, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and he who believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Meanwhile, Mary is angry and frustrated and brokenhearted. And Martha goes back to Mary and says, the master is here. And the English version of the story says that Mary came to meet him, and she fell at his feet and said, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. No, but I believe you can do something. Just, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And actually, in the original language, the language around Mary, I beg your pardon, arriving at the feet of Jesus is, and Mary collapsed into his arms. She is exhausted. And Jesus is on his way to the tomb to bring Lazarus back from the dead. So why did he cry? If he knew, and he didn't tell the sisters not to cry either. So they're breaking their hearts. And he sobs, he cries too. And I guess the fact that he cried shows us his humanity, Lisa. But the reasons for his crying are rather more challenging, because he could have said to Mary and Martha, it'll all be fine in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And it could be suggested that he was unkind not to tell them that. Because if somebody you know is going through a really tough time, and you know everything's going to be all right, the first thing you say to them is, everything's going to be all right. Now, Jesus had told Martha, that he was going to do something. Mary didn't even ask. And yet when he gets to the tomb, he breaks his heart. He weeps. He's brokenhearted at what is going on. And the scene is one of everybody crying. So you've got Mary crying, Martha crying, professional mourners have come to Bethany, they're crying, and Jesus is crying. And I think the reason that he cries is he sees the pain and the heartbreak that Mary and Martha are going through. And there is no other way for him to do what is being done in this moment. And he recognizes the pain that his followers will carry as they face death. And in allowing, I will say more about that later probably, but I don't want this to sound like a monologue. But in allowing Mary and Martha to cry, he redeems their grief. He enters into that grief so fully that he gives them permission to grieve in a holy and in a devoted way. And he cries probably because his friend has died, but he also knows his friend is coming back. He cries because of the distress of Mary and Martha. He cries because the people there don't understand. He cries because he knows how much it costs for people to follow him. And he cries because he knows the power of death in people's lives, and he is determined to overcome it. But it all costs something. And in his weeping, we find permission to weep, I think. In his sobbing, we find permission to break our hearts when we lose people that we love. These verses actually were very powerfully used in my life. And one half of Good Grief, the book I've written that you've referred to, deals with these verses, because this story on its own, singularly, beyond the shadow of a doubt, has transformed my theology of suffering, transformed my understanding of sorrow, pain, vulnerability, brokenness. But more particularly, my brother died very unexpectedly in March 2016. He collapsed on the 8th of March and died on the 9th. He was 58. He was my eldest brother, my big brother, Colin, and I loved him. I miss him very much. I miss him this weekend because it's Father's Day, and his daughter is moving today and contacted me over the weekend to say how much she missed her dad, and we had a bit of a cry together. But after he had died, I had no idea whether Colin had a faith or not. And I went back to his little house. He was a journalist, actually, a very successful journalist. But I went back to his house to find his will and to see what instructions needed to be carried out. Couldn't find it anywhere. And I went into his room and sat down, really anxious and cross on the bed. Yeah. And I said to God, help me find a bit of paper here. That's all I need. And I noticed that something lying on the floor. And when I looked, I went to pick it up. It was just an envelope, but beside it was a Bible. Actually, it was the Message Bible. I can show it to you. I'm not leaving. It was this Bible. It was this Bible here. Yeah. The Message. And I had bought this Bible for my mum many years before, when my dad had died. And she was in a nursing home. So she'd obviously given the Bible to my brother Colin, or he had asked her for it. I don't know how he got it. And inside that Bible was the will, Colin's instructions. And when I flicked it open, it fell open at John 11. And it fell open, and I noticed the verse where Jesus says to Martha, your brother will live again. Mm-hmm. And it was just, I think we call it a rhema word. It was a direct word into my heart. And God was saying to me, your brother will live again.
Wow, that's just an absolute moment of grace, isn't it? In the midst of such pain. And
it's carried me and my family.
Yeah.
Everything for him, for Colin.
Yeah. In Hebrews, in chapter 4, it talks about having the fact that we have Jesus as a high priest who's like us, who sympathizes with our weakness. And I think, knowing that Jesus cries, Jesus wept, is so important, isn't it? And how's that helped you through the difficult times, just to think that Jesus understands this, he's experienced this kind of...
It's transformed it. I have in understanding that Christ endures our sorrow with us, not just for us. And that I metaphorically, who understands, it gives you permission to explore all of the challenges of your humanity, all of the questions that you have about faith, without feeling as if somehow you're feeling a test. Many other religions talk of God's nearness, of God's immanence, but none speak of God retaining all of his godness, or God containing all of God's godness. Sorry, I didn't mean to use the male gender. God containing all of God's godness, and yet becoming human. And that unique story that God has endured and experienced all of humanity is profoundly important. It's actually picked up in Hebrews 5 as well, I think, Lisa, when Hebrews is one of these mysterious books around humanity and divinity, isn't it? But on a couple of occasions, I think in Hebrews 5, 9 and 10, it might be just a verse later, the writer talks about Christ being made perfect through suffering. Yeah. And becoming the source of our eternal salvation. And that perfection is not that there was something lacking in God, or that there was something missing, or that he was not the full article and then became the full article. The perfection that that the writer is talking about in Hebrews, I think, is the humanity of people being experienced in the Godhead, in the second person of the Trinity. So we all know that Jesus as a person did not exist in the Old Testament. People get freaked out when you say that. The second person of the Trinity did. The Son has always existed. And Hebrews makes that point very powerfully. But he takes on permanent humanity in Christ when Jesus is born. And by enduring that permanent humanity, he experiences limitation. Hebrews 5, 6 to 9 says that. And that constrains him. And he endures and experiences every part of human life. That is what I think it means for him to be made perfect. And in that experience and absorption of humanity, the risen Christ, the resurrected Jesus, is still human, but he is now a completely glorified human being. And therefore our humanity has been redeemed, not will be, has been redeemed, and is evidenced in the second person of the Trinity, who stands as an intercessory symbol before the Father not necessarily using words to pray for us. His presence is the intercession. Humanity has been redeemed because Christ has taken on our humanity, borne it, and suffered for us and died for us. But it is the cross that is the pinnacle of that. But the cross couldn't happen without the physical life of Christ. And it's not that the physical life of Christ is like an introduction or a prologue and the real thing, that Jesus only came for one moment. That one moment is built around by all of his humanity, and in experiencing humanity, in weeping, in laughing, in getting hungry, in needing to be carried onto a boat because he was exhausted, in getting tired, and having to learn how to walk, how to write, how to make a table, presumably from his stepfather, in having cares and concerns for his mother on the cross. And when he says to John, behold your mother, and mother, behold your son, carrying family responsibilities like you and I, facing the loss of loved ones like you and I, comforting friends like you and I. The weeping signifies all of that. And it makes God approachable. It makes us confident that God understands. There's a story told in the Second World War that the Queen Mother, after Buckingham Palace was bombed, turned to George VI, her husband, and said, now we can look the EastEnders in the eye. I'm not quite sure that Buckingham Palace being bombed is exactly the same as an East End, but that's another story. However, Christ can say that. Yeah. Christ can say, I can look humanity in the eye. God can look humanity in the eye and say, I've experienced this. I have gone through it, and you are not alone.
And it's just incredibly powerful, isn't it? And I think, through all the things that we walk through, just knowing that Jesus has walked that same path, and he intercedes out of that experience, is incredibly powerful, and such a huge gift to us.
When I lost when I was trying to come to terms with the losses that I'd experienced, and I don't think you ever come to terms with them. I had suicide in July 2014, a suicide in November 2014, a suicide in April 2015. My brother dropped dead in March 2016. My mum, my best friend in ministry, died in July 2016. My son's mother-in-law died, and my mum died. And I can remember one moment when I was trying to work this all out, and how do you, and my dad had died in 2002, but way back in 2002, when my dad died, he died of a very rare heart condition that we didn't know he had, and he dropped dead, and we came back to Bournemouth, where we were living at the time. And on the way back, I said to God, please don't let me have to bury anybody for a few months. Just give me space. And the day after I arrived back, one of my elders' wives, her father died of exactly the same thing as my dad. So I was thrown into this thing again. And one morning I was sitting in my study, and I was saying to God, I just can't do that. It's the closest I've ever come to leaving ministry and to leaving faith. And I just thought, I can't, there aren't any options here. And I was reminded of the words of Jesus to to Peter, when he started to talk about the cross in Matthew 16, and lots of people left. And he said to his disciples, are you going to leave me too? And Peter said to him, well, to whom else can we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. So I made a decision that I wasn't going to explore departing faith. However hard it was going to get, this was me for the long haul. And it was really, it was a really powerful moment. I heard a noise behind me, and I hadn't felt or experienced a sense of God for months and months and months and months. It was about 5 or 6 months after my dad died. And I thought I was praying it was an angel or something, but a divine message. It was the wind blowing through the French doors on the study, and it had moved some papers off a bookshelf. But I looked out onto the patio, and there was a small bird, I think a sparrow, I'm not sure, but a small bird on the patio. And I just knew something God was trying to say. God was saying something that I was needing to hear. And another bird came and landed beside it, a wee small one, smaller than that one. and walked along beside the big bird just for 3 or 4 minutes, and I just watched it. And having not heard anything from God for months and months and months, I felt God saying to me, I want to walk through your grief with you.
Mm.
I want you to be like that small bird.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to walk through it for you. I want to walk through it with you.
Mm.
And I read the Bible. It was the 2nd of January 2003. I read the Bible systematically. And that year I had decided to begin with John's Gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And I normally read 20 chapters of the Bible a day, Old Testament and New Testament. So on the 2nd of January, as I turned in to do my Bible reading, the first chapter that I was going to read was John 11. Mm-hmm. And Jesus walked through my grief with me. Mm. And I have been reading it. This is not an exaggeration. I've been reading John 11 every day ever since. I've been reading John 11 now every day for nearly 20 years. Because in it, I see God walking with me through my sorrow, not walking for me, and not even carrying me. He carries me when I can't walk, but pausing with me and giving me permission to pause, showing me when I need to speed up, showing me when I need to slow down, redeeming the memories of loss. When you've lost somebody, you create a memory picture. And that memory picture is often not accurate. It's picked up the emotions that you've gone through or your responses to that loss. So being able to walk through that loss again with Jesus enables you to correct those faulty memories. And some of the faults are sugarcoating your loss, and some of the faults are making it more severe than it was, or some are just misremembering. But because of his experience in John 11, because he wept, because of this story, Christians are able to pause and say, I can walk through not just my loss, family. Some have realized that their marriages aren't as strong as they are because of lockdown. Their kids will be kicking off because of the confinement. They'll be facing medical treatments. They'll be facing uncertainties. Some will have had treatments paused because of COVID-19 and will be anxious about what they're going back to. Christ's humanity gives us permission to walk through all of that without having to be phony, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely true. And so just one question really in closing. You just mentioned a little bit about the experience of this weird time and lockdown and everything that's around that. And it seems to me there's going to need to be some tears, if there haven't been already, and some lament and, disappointments. And I'm sure like you, led funerals with 5 people and people masked up. And there's a lot of kind of abnormal processing that's happening and people not being able to meet each other. How do you think that Jesus walks with us in that little bit, and what might we do to weep together and to be together and support each other through those things as this unravels?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, there's a wonderful prayer contained in the Northumbria prayer community's Celtic prayers for daily living around grief, and there's a line in it that says, "Walk slowly with grief, pausing often." Yeah. Unbidden thoughts will come. Unfinished conversations can be finished in him. Walk slowly with grief, pausing often. So I think the first thing I would suggest, and I'm not saying it's right, but I think we need to walk slowly. And I think we need to pause often. I think we need, as we begin to exit this current phase of lockdown, I don't think we're going to be in a normal set of circumstances for quite a long time. So accepting that is very helpful. And being able to then say, okay, I have to manage another new normal. It's actually more difficult, I think, for people to exit lockdown than it was to enter it, don't you?
Definitely.
There's an anxiety rises for people because they're now not only anxious about being in lockdown, they're anxious about spreading disease or catching disease or what it's going to mean. So I think we've got to enable people to pause often. We've got to stop with them. We've got to take our time. And that's not just going slowly. That is allowing our emotions to slow down a bit, our responses to slow down. I think alongside that, I don't know what you're doing, but we as a church family are right beside one of the biggest hospitals in Northern Ireland. So we are working with undertakers and with the local hospital and the hospice, which isn't very far from us, and with counsellors to create some public spaces for remembering. One of the things, I've, like you, buried a number of people through this season, but the saddest story was I went to school with a fellow who went off to Australia years ago, came back. I was away from Northern Ireland for 32 years, came back and he contacted me and said, could you visit my mum? I went to visit her. She wasn't very well. This was way before COVID. She then died of COVID. And 10 days later, her husband died of COVID. And I buried them both. And he couldn't get back from Australia for the funeral, so he was on Facebook, and it was all very difficult. But creating moments for community, families like that, they lived in a big housing estate, and that community to grieve together will be important. So we're going to have some memorial services. We're going to have some special services. We're going to offer to run private Thanksgiving services for people who don't know us, have nothing to do with our church family, but have buried loved ones through this season. We're going to offer some counselling service and support to those that have been impacted by the trauma of it all. Coming up to Christmas every year, on the first Sunday of December, we run a Christmas service for those that have lost loved ones across the year, which is quiet and reflective. A lot of our energy and time is going to be given to individuals, to listening, to counselling, and to creating spaces for them. And as a church, we're going to grieve together. We're going to celebrate, but we're going to grieve together. We're going to weep together. We're going to allow space for questions. We're going to create some context for people just to talk and to listen to each other's stories and set some parameters around that, and work with some counselling services here in Northern Ireland to try and help people process as much as they can their sorrow. And we'll revisit it as and when we need to.
Thanks, Malcolm. Do you have a copy of your book there that you can show us?
I do. Give me 1 second. Where did I put yours?
That's the one.
It's called Good Grief.
Yeah.
Living with Sorrow and Loss. And actually, if folk are interested, on my podcast channel, which is called Thin Places, I am going through podcasts on this, and there are already 10 episodes up. There's another 5 that will put up in the next couple of weeks. It's free to access. Just if you Google Thin Places with Malcolm Duncan, it'll be the top one. You can get it on iTunes, on Spotify, or on my webpage, which is malcolmduncan.co.uk, and you can access the podcast or order the book from my website as well.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. I know there's a huge amount of wisdom and content in that book for everyone to access. So thank you for being with us today. Really appreciate that.
Thank you so much.